When dealing with a falsehood, you're faced with two options. You can accept it or you can reject it. The basis upon which we take one of these actions is a product of our critical thinking capabilities and a desire to know what is true instead of confirming our bias. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. On Brainstorm, we choose the hard truths over the comforting lies. Reason, compassion, skepticism. This is the Brainstorm Podcast.
Hey folks, welcome to the Brainstorm Podcast Skeptic Studio, the interview show from Brainstorm where we talk to a variety of folks with the intent to spread critical thinking, compassion, and skepticism. Before we get started with this interview, I want to do a few announcements. First, in case you didn't see the posts on social media, there aren't going to be any live shows during the month of December. This is the last of the interviews I did during this month, and for the remaining 2 episodes this month, I'll be publishing unreleased interviews from the Hardcore Skeptic series on social justice. Obviously, those won't be paid posts on Patreon because they're old content that I just haven't gotten around to working on. But beyond that, for more details, check out the December news post on Patreon. It's set to public. I also posted it as a blog on brainstormblog.net, and I will put links to that in the show notes. Now, for today's content, this is an interview with Kevin Watson. Kevin uses the handle LibSocScientist on Twitter and runs the Facebook page that SJW the Nazis warned you about. I will provide links in the show notes to both of those. Kevin and I talked about Libertarian Socialism and what that means. It feels like we barely scratched the surface even after talking for almost an hour, but sometimes that's just how these ideas are. It often takes a lot of reading and a lot of listening, a lot of talking to people, and a lot of research to fully get into them. I hope this chat stokes your appetite for learning more about the subject. And I guess with that, we'll send you over to the interview right after this ad for some other podcast you should check out.
Welcome to Secular Soup. I'm Amy with a Y.
And I'm Amy with an I.
And we're just 2 blueberries floating in a bowl of tomato soup. Stay tuned for real talk about atheism, feminism, politics, parenting, and whatever the fuck else we want to talk about because this is our show. And get ready for a whole lot of motherfucking profanity. Buckle up, bitches. It's time to have some soup. I would tell them they can find us wherever podcasts are, but they're listening to this right now. So if you're that stupid that you're listening to this show and you don't know where to listen,
if we have to tell you how to find podcasts,
then you're hopeless.
All right, welcome to the Brainstorm Podcast Skeptic Studio. Tonight I'm talking to Kevin Watson, aka LibSocScientist on Twitter, and
yeah, I pronounce it LibSocScientist because LibSoc is just kind of the abbreviation for Libertarian Socialism. But yeah, that's my Twitter handle, otherwise known as that SJW the Nazis warned you about on Facebook. So figure I may as well get all the little shout outs out of the way beforehand.
Yeah, for sure. I'll definitely have links for those in the show notes for this. So obviously we're going to talk about Libertarian Socialism at some point, but I guess first we might as well get to know you a little bit. What is your background? A little bit about maybe your education and what you do, stuff like that.
Yeah, sure thing. So, my background is, I grew up in the far northern end of California, a very rural, conservative area. Got into tech and software and computers real early in life. Back in high school, I was doing a lot of that kind of stuff. Eventually did a little bit of studying in college. Never managed to get a degree, although that I've been really kind of fortunate and privileged in that hasn't really negatively impacted my ability to, get a job or work in the field. So that's good. And these days I'm doing software support and, working with development teams at a software company where I currently live in Boston. So that's a little bit about me is in terms of just kind of, what I'm doing with my life. Yeah.
Very cool. So I guess, how did you come to your, the philosophy of libertarian socialism?
That's a bit of a longer story. So, despite growing up in a very conservative region, blame it on my upbringing or the internet, what have you, not sure, but I've always felt like I've been a fairly I want to say liberal, but in kind of the vaguest sense possible, the sense that you often hear used on cable news and not the more academic liberal sense. Just, basically believing that, people deserve equal rights and people deserve to not be discriminated on the basis of things over which they have no control, and, making sure people are treated fairly and kindly as much as possible by others in society. Eventually the Bernie Sanders campaign came around, and he started, more openly using the term socialism. Although, that was kind of a misnomer for himself, but hey, it's how he wanted to identify. But that actually got me looking into, okay, what actually is this socialism thing? And, why is he suddenly okay with saying it? And is what he's talking about actually socialism? And for the most part, the answer to that question ended up being no. Right. He's definitely for, fairer treatment of people, especially the most disadvantaged groups. And, I very much applaud him on that. But unfortunately, the way in which he wants to make those things happen is still very much within the capitalist side of things. That is to say, people, it's still primarily businesses and things that will be, running the day-to-day of productivity in America, and, just essentially controlling them a little bit better. And so you tend to get into more of what's known as social democracy, which is to say, basically, it's kind of the welfare state, but bumped up a little bit more to where it's, you have the government providing a lot of services to people, but it's still very much, by definition, a capitalist system. Anyways, so getting into a lot of that and kind of reading more about it, I realized that, hey, this socialism thing, not the Bernie Sanders one, but the actual one, is actually not a terrible idea. And, but of course, then you get into the stuff about, what about the USSR? And, that's, to me, that's actually incredibly fair, because unfortunately the USSR and communist China and, all of these other very authoritarian regimes did, a lot of what they called socialism or communism. And I'll go into kind of why, a lot of people on in the libertarian socialist community disagree with that name. But essentially it's just, what they did was basically they took all of the production and the productive capacity of their territories and brought them all under very centralized control. And what libertarian socialism and related philosophies advocate is, no, we actually want that stuff to be under the direct control of the people doing the work.
Right.
So, right now it's, everything is under the control of whoever owns the land or the building or the tools that you're working with. Under a USSR style thing, everything's owned by the government or the state or, whatever name you'll give to that entity, which is, the thing that controls everything. Yeah. And we're saying, yeah, neither of those really work for us. We don't like this idea of being controlled from above, whether that be, a private entity or a government entity, whatever. We want to be in control of our own, production, our own fate, as it were, and not have it dictated to us from on high. So, that's kind of very core to the entire philosophy of libertarian socialism is, we don't like the idea of, a privately owned, property. We don't like the idea of government-owned property. We want it, we essentially want to abolish, both of those and let it be community controlled. Let the people who are in the community control, what is done with the resources that they have and go from there. And we believe that it's going to be in the people's best interest to have a direct say in how those sorts of things are controlled. And so that, as I, progressed and evolved in my understanding of this has been a philosophy that really resonates with me because it is, it kind of fits into that core belief that I feel like I've had, for the entirety of my life, which is to say, it's not okay for people to control you without some reason that, some agreement on your part or some reason that they should. So, the entire philosophy of anarchism and libertarianism is, these sorts of hierarchies that we build are really, manifestly unjust, and they should be justified before implemented. And that kind of resonated with me personally, just because I'm a very independent sort of person. I like to be able to do my own thing. I don't like having people tell me what to do, but I also very much care about making sure that, not only are people not being, controlled, but people are being cared for. So,
right.
So the idea that, people working together voluntarily, but, with a goal of improving not just the individual's position, but the community's well-being at large has always been a philosophy that really kind of speaks to me.
Yeah. I have to say I relate to a lot of that. I discovered a kind of anarchism. I think it was in 2012. I really started reading into it. The idea that systems of power, like hierarchies, are kind of inherently unjust, and that coercion is a negative thing, obviously. It seemed like our society is kind of based in a lot of ways on coercion and enforced rules through power over individuals.
Yeah, I mean, and it really always has been. I mean, you go back to when we started progressing from a hunter-gatherer society where, for the most part, with some large exceptions, was, a pretty much powerless society. And that is to say that, individuals weren't powerless, but that you didn't tend to find people exerting large amounts of control over others. Once we progressed from that into an agrarian society after the agricultural revolution, well, suddenly you have this situation where this one person suddenly controls, all of this stuff that all these other people need. You have the farmer controlling the food that other people need to eat to survive. And so that naturally sets up this power dynamic that says, well, I have control over this. This is mine to say what will be done with. And, you all have to, do whatever I say in order to get this thing, which will let you survive. And so as, not to say the agricultural revolution was bad, it's led to, these amazing amounts of food, and it led to a lot of freedom for people because, you went from literally having to hunt and forage all day just to survive to now being able to grow a bunch of food. And so now you could put your energy into other things. But it's a trade-off that, I think a lot of people are realizing maybe this doesn't necessarily need to exist. Maybe we can just say, hey, we're going to cooperate. Some people are good at, farming and growing food and building houses, and some people are better at, more intellectual pursuits like science and art and technology and all of these things. And maybe instead of making this a competitive society, we could make it a cooperative one where we're all working together toward a goal of mutual beneficial development, as opposed to, I get mine, and if you've got enough, you get yours, and if you don't, well, screw off. And so that's kind of where I am in terms of just looking at the history of humanity and seeing that, these sorts of power systems have always existed. And it went from, farmers owning the land to rulers owning the land and, essentially leasing it out to farmers for a tax to, these giant kingdoms where a king ruled an entire country and, gave that out to lords and they gave it out to dukes and they gave it out to the farmers and just this whole and the term is blanking on me at the moment, but essentially just that same thing of, I own the land and I let you use it because you give me stuff. And, all of this is, of course, is enforced with violence and always has been, otherwise what's to stop someone from just coming in and planting stuff? Well, without actually giving you, the landlord, anything. Well, the threat of you sending your soldiers to kill him. And so that's kind of why the entire idea of like private property of, I own this land and you can only use it because I say so. And I only say so when you do something for me, has always been kind of a very problematic, thing within society building and doesn't necessarily need to exist for society to exist, but has because power tends to perpetuate itself.
Right. Yeah. It resists the change that might take its power away.
Exactly. And those in power both have the incentive to and have the ability to preserve their own power. And again, that's the self-perpetuating nature of it. And the idea that, anarchists, we don't want to take the power for ourselves. We want to eliminate the structures that lead to power in the first place because we don't believe it's an inherent thing. We believe it's something that has been constructed and doesn't have a need to exist just to make sure that all of these other bits of society that are good and are beneficial for those to exist. We don't need those power structures in place. We can find another way to do this, a better way to do this, a way that increases and maximizes the benefit to all instead of just for a few.
Right. So I guess, we've gone through quite a bit already, but
I'm sorry. I tend to ramble and I get into, I'm not one to kind of, beat around the bush. I kind of get into the meat and potatoes pretty quickly, and unfortunately, that can turn people off kind of quick. So I apologize if I kind of got into that rather quickly.
No, that's fine. I just for listeners, I think I got to take a couple steps back, and maybe we should define some of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So, what are we talking about when we say libertarianism?
Okay, so libertarianism actually came about when it was an anarcho-communist Joseph de Jacques first used the term to kind of describe his own political ideas, and essentially libertarianism in its original kind of conception was this idea of, to put it in a very kind of maybe cliched phrase at this point, no gods, no masters. And that is to say, that people have a right to do as they please within their own lives. They have the right to control their own bodies, their own minds, and not to be ruled by an outside force without their consent. And so that's so libertarianism, if you, really expand on that philosophy and kind of bring it to its logical conclusions, ends up meaning things like no property, or at least no private property. That is to say, and I'll get into the distinction between private and personal property in a moment, but sure. Basically, you do not have a right to own something just to, make someone else suffer to use it.
Right, to limit access to it.
Yeah, you don't have the right to own a home just to make someone else pay you to live there. If you have a home that you live in and you actively make use of, great. I'm all for that. that's perfectly fine. But if you're going to go and buy a home just to make someone else rent it from you, just to make income from that, just to profit off that, I'm not okay with that. And so, and you could say the same thing about a lot of other situations. The concept of owning land for a business, a restaurant, a factory, what have you, just to make other people come in and do the work and, actually create the value that you then sell, and then you choose how much of that value that was generated you're going to pay them because of this kind of nebulous thing they call the market. And I'm like, I'm getting kind of very into Marxist philosophy here, which is its own whole ball of wax, and we'll go into that. But basically the idea is, no man has the inherent right to control the life, destiny, or action of another. And in a lot of ways, the power structures that we have set up, whether they be that of a state or a government, that of a corporation or a business, that of, the concept of property being defended by some form of, quote unquote, acceptable violence, whatever, violence's acceptability is a whole other topic, but, all of these things are set up usually in a way that allows one person, or usually a small segment of people, to directly influence and control the lives of a much larger segment of people. And that power imbalance is something that libertarians in general, I would say, even if you go to, some of the more right-wing libertarians, will have some disagreements about, the smaller things like the concept of property, but, the idea that, governments and, religious institutions and large corporations shouldn't be able to control you in that way is pretty common. So, I'd say that's a decently concise take on what the term libertarianism refers to. I
recently, listened to the audiobook for, it's called Democracy in Chains. And
not familiar with it.
It's by Nancy McLean, I think is her name. And she talks about kind of the right-wing view of libertarianism, where they use much of the same language, where they don't want like the majority to be in control of individuals, and they don't want government to be taking, control over a single person's actions or whatever. But they've also kind of distorted it in a way. So then it extends to, they can have all this private property, and instead of government controlling them, they just use it to control work in a sense, or like to control labor.
Yeah. And so one of the issues I have with the right-wing side who tends to call themselves libertarians is that they do still defend the right to private property. And so as libertarians on the right will often tell you that they are anti-state, and they'll often use, statist as a type of insult, basically saying, oh, well, you support the existence of a state. You want to be controlled by this other force. And one thing I'll say kind of like they disagree with is that the concept of private property is inherently a statist institution, because there is exactly one way to defend private property, and that is through some form of violence. Mm-hmm. Because if someone comes to your land and wants to use your land to plant their crops, well, the only way you have to stop them from doing that is by actively forcing them off your land, or destroying the crops that they've planted, or interfering with them in some way. That's the only way property works. It's, property is, in the most basic sense, the concept that I alone have the right to decide what is done with this thing. whether that thing be a plot of land or a house or a cat tree, and I use that example because it's literally right next to me, whatever it is. And that is the concept of property. It is one person's exclusive right to use a thing or decide how it is used. And so when we're talking about these larger instances of property, land is just the easiest example because it's kind of ubiquitous. The only way to prevent someone else from using it is through violence or threat of violence. And in our modern system, if you have title to a piece of land and someone is using it in a way that you do not consent to, your recourse is to call up the police and to have them take that person off your land. And our laws are set up in such a way that allow you to do that. But it's still a form of violence to be to have someone removed from your land in that way. And so the idea that private property is still something that these libertarians on the right want to and I keep saying that just to kind of distinguish it from, people like myself, libertarians on the left or libertarian socialists, anarcho-communists, etc. The only way they have to defend that is to either inflict that violence themselves or rely on a state to do it. And if they are true in what they say, that they are anti-state, then the only recourse they have is to defend it themselves. And, if they have enough people that want to use that land because of some survival need, for instance, that they are preventing from doing that, well, then they're going to have to go up against a fairly large, angry mob of people who want to use that land, which is why they tend to support the state in that way. And so when you talk to a lot of libertarians, they won't tell you that they'll say they don't want the complete elimination of government because they still need it for the protection and defense of their private property. And so it's for that reason that, the right-wing libertarians don't actually want to get rid of the state. They just want to minimize so that it protects them specifically. And, so that is the biggest issue I have with, modern right-wing libertarianism is it's really just a way of saying, I want to get mine and fuck everyone else. And, yes, a lot of libertarians are going to have a problem with that characterization, and I'm sure they'll have 1,000 different arguments, mostly pulled from Ayn Rand, I'm sure, about how that's wrong. But that is the only logical take on it that I have been able to find, and that even comes close to justifying the inherent contradiction in their philosophy.
Yeah, that was something that I noticed pretty distinctly, is that they're anti-government infraction or like imposition of their government will in any way, except they're very pro-military and very pro-police. So yeah,
and to avoid the straw man, I do find a lot of libertarians who are anti-military and who are against the militarization of police, and I applaud them for those stances because, I do believe that is in keeping with a true libertarian philosophy, but they do make those exceptions about, protection of property and whatnot, and that, that's where I kind of butt heads with a lot of them. So because of that, it's, the people on, I'm sure you've seen that political alignment chart that's, left to right. And then you've got authoritarianism at the top and libertarianism at the bottom. And, in a very kind of unnuanced, generalized way, we tend to kind of put people into different categories. And, so libertarian socialists and their kin tend to be in the bottom left of that graph. And we do tend to find ourselves a little bit isolated because we can't really find a lot of unity with the more authoritarian, the more authoritarian people on the left, for a number of reasons, but the primary one being that centralization of control. And it's hard to find a lot of common ground with the people on the bottom because of the concept of private property and how they want to defend it. and you'll find a lot of takes from people on the LibSoc side that that either tend to find more common ground with one or the other, and some that just completely want to do away with them both. And so even within these various communities, there's so much conflict and disagreement, and unfortunately it's one of the things that's kind of prevented us from getting any amount of unity to actually take down these institutions we find harmful. And I'm guessing the capitalists who like this setup kind of prefer it that way. So it's something that the community is trying to kind of get over, but it's a little bit difficult to get there just because there is an inherent amount of conflict when you're dealing with, philosophies of how society should work.
Yeah, for sure. I know. I find that I have more in common with other leftists, even if they're more authoritarian than I am. Versus, I don't have as much in common with libertarian capitalists.
Yeah, and I would definitely tend to agree with that, just because, if I absolutely have to pick between a statist institution and a capitalist one, well, I'm going to generally find that the statist one is maybe a little bit less harmful, depending how it's constructed. At least in most modern liberal countries, we have some, shadow of true democracy in place to where, we can actually, have some say in that. But then, of course, we have to, even the most politically aware people do have a tendency to kind of ignore the non-West, as it were. That is to say,
Right.
the European type or European style countries. So, most of the you got the EU, North America, Australia, Japan, places like that, where, they've all kind of taken on this, European style democracy that's really just kind of, the rich and powerful remaining rich and powerful, with some semblance of the people having, input in the decision-making process. But, all that said, it's, I still consider it maybe a little bit better than the alternative of, a complete anarchy, a complete situation of anarchy where it's, whoever has the most bread is the one in power, and he gets to say whatever he wants, and that's
Right.
what goes because he controls it. So, at the very least, states are not necessarily as harmful as, a capitalist situation. So, if we can set up socialism under a more democratic situation, I'd probably be happy with that. But, long term, I'm looking for, complete abolishment of state powers and just, cooperating communes, essentially, federating with one another. There's a lot to it, unfortunately,
sure.
and maybe a little more than a single podcast episode can go into.
That's right.
Although I will give one book recommendation, which is kind of the anti-Ayn Rand Fountainhead / what's the other one? Damn it, I've actually forgotten the name of the other book. Ayn Rand Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. There it is.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's her kind of, her two most famous books, and the ones, all the right-wing libertarians tend to claim. Well, there's a very good one that kind of gives a very in-depth look at the comparison between an anarcho-communist style society and a more democratic capitalist one. It's called The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, and is not to plug it too much, but I read it earlier this year, and it's essentially the story of a scientist from a planet whose entire society is based around, a libertarian socialist type philosophy, visiting a society that is, it's actually very much a kind of analog to the Earth in the 70s, and the country visited is very similar to, the United States or any of the other they're kind of liberal democracies in the 70s, and they're conflicted against a more authoritarian communist country and locked in a sort of state of Cold War. So it was both a social commentary on the current situation, and then contrasting that to a completely different philosophy that is essentially libertarian socialism. And so because of that, I feel like it gives a really good kind of portrayal of what the society we as libertarian socialists believe is possible versus kind of what we have today or had 40 years ago.
Okay.
So I would definitely recommend, anyone listening to this read that book. It's very engaging. The narrative is extremely interesting, but it also gives a lot of good details about how a society like that can function.
Neat. I'll definitely maybe grab that.
Yep.
It's a story, like a fiction novel with these kind of philosophies into it, not like a straight philosophy book, eh?
Yeah, exactly. It's providing a philosophy through a narrative. And, I know personally that's definitely the way I kind of enjoy digesting that sort of stuff, that, if you're into that sort of thing, if you're into the more heavy philosophical, ideas that are behind it, there are a plethora of authors from Peter Kropotkin through Pierre-Joseph Proudhon through the more modern Murray Bookchin and Abdullah Öcalan, who have all kind of wrote in extreme depth on these sorts of topics.
Right.
But I do find that the narrative, the idea of giving a philosophy through a narrative is very effective. And it's honestly probably why Ayn Rand is so popular, because,
right.
Although, you won't find many philosophers today who actually have any respect for her ideas, she managed to get a very large following through that narrative portrayal of her philosophy,
right.
and managed to get quite the large following even today. And I do feel like it makes sense to kind of put that into a story, a fictional story about people, where you can kind of reflect what you want to see, but through the lives and experiences of these fictional people, and in fact, in this case, through an alien society.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'll definitely have to check that out.
Yep. And if you want some other good socialist propaganda, go watch Star Trek. If you have watched any of Star Trek, you have watched socialist propaganda, and you will find a lot of right-wing libertarians who seem to have completely missed that message. And the lines about there no longer being money and the accumulation of wealth no longer being the driving force in our lives that Picard and Sisko and various other characters give throughout that series just seem to have completely missed them. It seems.
Right. Eh? Yeah. Just the, I don't know. Everybody's, once you have replicator technology, there's no scarcity, right? So
yeah, and the lack of scarcity is usually a pretty big motivator to going to a more socialist route. But the thing about scarcity is that it's kind of a hard concept to exactly pin down and specifically to measure. And the thing about capitalism is that even when we get to the point where scarcity could, in theory, be eliminated, the concept of artificially creating scarcity comes into play, where they see this situation where, oh well, we could just make these resources available to everyone, we have enough, and turning that into, well, if we say we don't have enough, we can charge more money for it.
Right.
And so it's, and so unfortunately, there are a lot of people, unfortunately there's not a ton of data necessarily to back this up. And so I'm still kind of on the fence about it, but I do see, an excessive amount of waste in our society, where, we could be providing for the needs of the needy,
right.
and, and allowing people to have those things that they require to survive and to thrive. And it seems to me like there is enough to go around, and we're just not doing it. And we're probably not doing it because there's no profit motive in doing it. And of course, that's not necessarily true all around the world. There are definitely places where there is mass scarcity, and we have not developed those areas to the point where we can, generate the resources that they need to get by. And so I think on a global level, we may not quite be there yet, but certainly in a lot of places, the US, Canada, and, those Euro type countries that I spoke about earlier, almost all of them probably could, and do so with relative ease. And the fact that we don't is just because the people in power don't want that to happen. And, unfortunately, I talk about the people in power a lot, sounding very much like a conspiracy theorist. And honestly, I don't necessarily think there is a giant conspiracy. I don't think there is a giant cooperation or, a bunch of, old crusty white men in a room saying, oh, well, we're going to do this specific thing. We're going to, make sure there's not enough food to go around, or not enough, houses for everyone to move into. And I'm not at all suggesting that's a thing that's happening. I'm suggesting that the way our society has been set up has led to a mass amount of that sort of behavior. And no one had to agree or, conspire to do it. It's just how the system is set up, and it automatically influences people those in power to preserve their power, and, to do the things that will keep them where they are, and to try and increase their wealth. And, consciously or unconsciously, unfortunately, the game of resources is a zero-sum game, and you can't have one person hoarding all these resources without a bunch of other people going without. And it's, the amount of matter on our planet is finite, and the amount of usable resources is even more so. And so, people like to accumulate to have a sense of security. And, there's been a lot of research with psychology, regarding, people getting more only makes them want more. And so, it's an unfortunate, side effect of the society, but it's also, or the structure of society, but it's also what makes myself and people like me consider it manifestly unfair and want to see a massive change.
For sure. It makes me think of, like, there are more homes right now in the US that are empty than there are people to fill them that are homeless, there's enough. Yeah.
The homeless population is roughly, I think the last statistic I saw this, 1/6 of the size of the number of vacant dwellings in the U.S. And that's assuming you put one person per dwelling, and I say dwelling to incorporate homes, apartments, cottages, whatever.
Right.
And you could fit one person per dwelling and still have 5 times that number left over. And one of the common counter arguments I see on this, and I kind of understand to a point, is, a lot of these homes are foreclosed for safety reasons, or, they won't have they're not up to code, or they're damaged in some way. And I'm like, okay, yeah, fine. Let's say half of them are in a state that no human should be living in them. Well, that still leaves 3 times as many usable houses as there are people who need usable houses.
Yeah, that's right.
And, and there are other considerations as well, talking about heating and water and food and all of that stuff. And that's also fair, but I feel like, even under the current system we have, much less a more, equitable system where, we actually take care of those in need, having a home is such a huge thing for everything else in your life. If you don't have a mailing address and a place to go and, a place to go back to and sleep at night, much less, have a few clothes and some food in your belly, you're going to have a hell of a time getting a job and actually getting toward the rest of that stuff. So giving people homes and maybe, a little bit of assistance to kind of get themselves, on the path to, the capitalist idea of the worker, who supports themselves, then, that's going to be a huge step in that fight to kind of end this mass poverty that we're seeing, despite being, among the richest nations and the richest societies in the world. The fact that we can't it's not that we can't provide, it's that we won't. And because there's no political or, profit, there's no profit margin to be made off it, and there's no political will to do it, things of that nature. And so it's kind of disgusting that we base so much of our actions, in this country around whether or not it will be profitable or whether or not it will keep some elected politician in power. And those are the two biggest, motivators of the powerful actually doing something. And to their credit, there are some people who make token efforts to kind of help with that. Bill Gates is a big one that comes to mind. I'm sure even Jeff Bezos does a fair amount of charity work.
Right.
But you compare the amount they give to the vast, and I'm talking fucking comprehensible amounts of wealth that these people actually have.
Yeah.
It kind of makes me sick to my stomach just to think about it. The fact that we could be doing all these things, but we're not, because reasons. It is essentially what I feel like it comes down to.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It actually did remind me of a point I was going to make earlier about the this idea of anarcho-capitalists or libertarian capitalists. Like, if there's a class of people who have all of the property and they get to decide who gets the bread or who gets enough money to feed themselves, like, I don't really get how that's an anarchist ideal, right?
Yeah, and if you actually look into it, it's really not. And so the idea like one of the more common counter arguments I've received from, people who call themselves anarcho-capitalists is the idea of, they do try to trap you into these like logical
Right.
traps. And so, like, the one I heard was, if you own a lawnmower, for instance, and you pay some kid to mow your lawn, is that an acceptable thing? And what they're trying to get at is basically the lawnmower in that situation is the private property. It is the thing that you are using to extract value out of someone else. And, you would have to find a way to kind of quantify, how much value does having your lawn mowed give to you versus how much you're paying the kid who mows your lawn. And, so the idea of private property is one that they kind of defend by saying, well, this is mine. I can do whatever with it that I wish. And that is that is kind of where the individualism comes in, because they're not thinking to, okay, what allows this to be claimed as, quote, yours,
right.
But just, they kind of go off the base assumption, well, things are mine. I have things.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, we all have things, but how we use them makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
And,
it's not.
And they get into the straw man of, we're going to come take your toothbrush, because they fail to understand the whole, personal versus private property thing. And I guess maybe it's a good idea to kind of explain what that means.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've gone into that a little bit already, but basically personal property is just anything that you yourself use to benefit your life. And, you may even be able to use that to create value for someone else and then, move that on through selling it or, trade, barter, whatever. Private property is very similar, except that you are not the one using it. You are giving it to someone, usually temporarily, in fact, pretty much exclusively temporarily, to be used on your behalf. So that is, say, I'll just bring it down to a really, really simple example, a bicycle. You have a bicycle. You use it to get around. You use it to go to the store to buy groceries and bring it back. Fine. Suddenly someone else needs to use your bicycle. That's great. However, in order for you to let them use your bicycle, they have to pay you a certain amount of money. That bicycle has gone from being your own personal property to private property because you are using it to extract value out of someone else.
Right.
And, the common defense of that is, well, I bought the bicycle, therefore it's mine. Well, who did you buy that from? And it gets into a very kind of deep, you've got to go, generations and generations and generations of transactions back to really identify, where this bicycle came from and who actually owns it. And, there's usually a lot of monetary exchange in there. So one argument I used once was going back to a very, very, very basic idea of, let's just say you happen to be on a piece of land, and on this piece of land, through your own labor, you have cut down the trees and done all the woodwork to build yourself a house and a little fence, and you have a little garden, and that's what you feed yourself from. Great. Okay. That whole situation, personal property. You've put your own labor into it. You've reaped the rewards from it. Great. Now someone else wants to come into that area that you have claimed as your own, and they want to use it to grow their own crops. Well, you don't want that to happen because then there's, supposedly less room for you to grow yours. I mean, we're saying, in my imagination, this is along a riverbank in a forest, so there's not really, but for the sake of argument, let's just say there is. And so in order to prevent them from doing this, you have to, keep them off your land. And so so you get into this philosophical question of what gives you the right to that land in the first place. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've worked the ground to grow the crops. You've taken down the trees to build the house. But the land, the ground under your feet, that was never yours to begin with. That was only ever something that was there. And I remember seeing a quote on a poster, supposedly, of a Native American chieftain whose name escapes me at this point, but I don't even remember the quote exactly, but it was, saying something along the lines of, who gave anyone the right to claim land as their own? The land is just there. Yes, you can work it, you can plant seeds to get crops, but even after you pull the crops out, the land's still there. You haven't really done anything to it. You've used some of it to benefit yourself in some way through your own labor. Great. You've generated that value for you, but the land was never yours. You just happened to pick a spot that was beneficial to you and do your stuff there. And so, we go into this idea of, it's my property because I bought it, and it was their property to sell because they bought it, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth, back through, probably thousands, tens of thousands of transactions to the first person who claimed that land as theirs. Well, they didn't buy it from anyone. They just
claimed it.
They claimed it. And if you go back to the settlers of the early West, it was, in a lot of cases, the U.S. stealing land from the native tribes who live there, claiming it as their own, and then giving it or selling it to settlers. Yeah, that's right. And because of that, those settlers or the people they sold it to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, now, now have a claim that, oh, well, this is mine because I bought it. And it's just if you steal a rope from someone and then you sell it to someone else, does that make the rope any less stolen? No, not in my opinion, and not in the opinion of most philosophers. And so the idea of property is inherently violent, and how anyone can call themselves an anarchist while still supporting that concept just doesn't make sense to me from any sort of ontological or philosophical standpoint. And you really have to either ignore history and ignore the history of that thing that you're claiming as your own property to really justify that, because that's the only way it makes sense. Is, you basically don't dive deep enough into the history of that thing. Because anything that anyone has ever claimed as their own property, it was never really theirs, or the person they bought it from's, or so on and so forth. It's all been stolen from someone else, and that's kind of where libertarian socialism has the idea of the commons. And so if you ever hear the quote, property is theft, that, I believe, if I recall correctly, came from Pierre Joseph Proudhon, who I mentioned earlier, and it was essentially this idea that there is no such thing as property. Anything you claim as property is simply something you've stolen from everyone else to be able to use. And so because of that, it's, we don't believe that property, can or should exist, especially not in a way that, is designed to exploit the labor of others. Sure, this nail clipper that I have in my hands, it's mine because I bought it, but if someone else wants to use it, I'm not going to make them pay me to use it. It doesn't belong to me in that way. It belongs to me because I use it every once in a while, and I need to clip my nails. If someone else wants to use it to clip their nails, go right the fuck ahead. As long as I can still use it at the end of the day, I ain't mad.
Yeah. Something that I was thinking of when you were talking about the lawnmower example is that it's not so much that people have an issue with you owning a lawnmower or even paying somebody to mow your lawn. It's when you hire that person out to mow other people's lawns and you charge $50 a lawn and pay him $5.
Oh yeah. And that is kind of like the example that you gave is the nature of capitalism itself. I was making this argument to a coworker of mine, and he was telling me he used to own a construction business, and I was kind of arguing with him. Okay, so let's say company X hires you to do some digging, and you send your guys out there with their backhoes, and they do the work and they dig the hole for whatever it was needed for, and then you get paid for that job. Okay. How much of that labor did you do yourself? For the vast majority of business owners, the answer is probably none. Right. You probably didn't even talk to the client. You have people for that. And so, the fact that you are the one who ends up getting the profit because you have a set amount of money that you give to your workers for this that, you agreed upon or you dictated in most cases, and then you negotiated a rate with this other company. Well, chances are you're keeping a chunk of what they paid you and, paying a smaller chunk of that to the guys who actually did the labor. And, there's all this defense of, oh, well, I invested in the equipment and in the marketing and in the people to get the job. And I'm like, that's all well and good. But essentially all you've done here is told me that, oh, well, you had enough money at the beginning to invest in the first place to be able to make all this shit happen. And now you're stealing from the people who actually create the labor, the value for you. And, that's kind of the biggest thing about capitalism we have the problem with. It's not even necessarily, in a lot of cases that, you're making profit on the job. Good for you. Like, you were able to, use fewer resources to do the job than you were paid in resources for the job. And, if you can make that happen with another group, okay, I don't necessarily think it's fair, but for the time being, I'm going to put that aside and just be like, but what you should have done is, share that profit equally with the people who actually did the work for you. Or better yet, give them the decision-making power of how much they get paid in the first place. And, then it gets into a whole collective bargaining union situation and, obviously that's a big issue of debate, even in the, liberal capitalist world. But, the idea of giving your workers that control to say, how much of the work they did, and how much of that profit they deserve, that's really what we're kind of arguing for in the short term. And so you may or may not have heard of the concept of a cooperative business where the workers are, also all part owners in the business, and they do collectively make those types of decisions.
So I guess we're coming up on about an hour. We might as well call it a session. There's still a lot more to talk about, but
Yeah, like this is not a small topic. I've given you maybe a slight hint, and one thing I would suggest to your listeners is there are actually quite a lot of good people out there talking about this kind of stuff. I'm going to give Cory a few links to different YouTube channels, and I know YouTube channels, may or may not be people's cup of tea, but they're usually decently short videos under like 20 minutes in most cases, and they go into these topics really in depth, and not only these, but also many related topics. A couple of ones I'm going to give an immediate shout out to, though, are a YouTube channel called ContraPoints, a YouTube channel called PhilosophyTube, one called Bad Mouse Productions, and there's a fourth one I was going to give a shout out to, but I can't remember the name offhand. Let me just see if I can figure it out.
Yeah, I actually I'm subscribed to all of those.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. Yeah, there's a fourth one that's another Ancom Brit. I just can't think of his name right now.
I for socialist content, I do really like also Mexie. She's a Canadian, but
gotcha.
Yeah, I don't know what her leaning is towards libertarian or anarchism or versus statism or whatever, but yeah, she's still good. She's really good in a lot of ways. Very very social justice minded.
Well, I will. I'll definitely give her a look. That you said her name was Mexie.
Mexie, Mexie.
Oh, found her. Excellent. Well, I will. I'll definitely give that a look. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Yeah. So, like I said, recommend all of those to your listeners. They're all incredibly educational and go into this stuff in amazing amounts of detail, and often in very relatable ways. So, it's a really kind of great community of people to get involved with, because they don't just focus on socialism, but they go into a lot of social justice type stuff as well, and do so in a way that, in at least the case of ContraPoints of PhilosophyTube, these are people who who studied in quite in depth in philosophical academia, and really have a good grounding on what they're talking about, versus me, who's just an amateur who likes to watch a lot of YouTube and debate shitheads of mine. That's honestly where most of my knowledge comes from, because I just like talking about this shit and learning about it that way. So, definitely give those people a watch. I think you'll end up learning quite a lot from it.
Fair enough. I've been an amateur skeptic and SJW and socialist anarchist for a while. I'm
gotcha.
The working class cred is I think part of my thing, rather than the educated person. But
yeah, and I tried not to use a ton of jargon, like the classics of like proletariat and bourgeoisie. Right. There's that does tend to be a little jargony and hard to understand. And I feel like the channels and channels I watch and the people I talk to, tend to be a little bit more down to earth. You don't have to be a massively book read person to get a good understanding of this stuff, and at least to get the gist of why it is why it's what a lot of people have chosen as their particular ideology.
Yeah, you can at least like whet your appetite a little bit, and maybe if you learn enough from that, maybe you might want to read some of the philosophy and get into that. But
yeah, definitely agree.
All right, well, I guess like we said at the start, you're at LibSoc Scientist on Twitter, and the SJW the Nazis warned you about.
Yep, that's me.
On Facebook.
I'm not nearly as active on Twitter, but that one I do. The Facebook page I do tend to post a fair amount on.
Awesome.
So.
I will. I'll actually go. I think I'll like that page right now, and very cool. I will. I will definitely spread those links around. And thanks for joining me.
Sounds good. Thank you very much for having me, and you have a great day.
You too.
All right, bye-bye.
Have a good one.
If you like what we're doing and want to help us keep the lights on, go become a patron at patreon.com/Brainstorm Podcast. You can hear the bonus half hour that we record every episode and get a shout out when you support the show. Become a patron for just $1 an episode at patreon.com/Brainstorm Podcast. Or you can support the show by ordering a t-shirt, mug or other gear from our store at caffeepress.ca/Brainstorm Podcast Gear. If you can't afford to become a patron or buy gear, then why not give us a rating or write a review on iTunes or Stitcher? Every rating makes it easier for people to find us. Thanks for your support.
Okay, so that's it for that one. I hope you really liked it. I know that Kevin recommended some YouTube channels there at the end, so I'll add some links for those in the show notes. Basically, at this point, I recommend you check out not just skeptical content or atheist content, like I've always recommended, but I think we should also be all following and supporting our fellow leftists. I know that some folks will disagree with me about standing in solidarity with some of the more authoritarian brands of leftism in order to counter right-wing politics, but I really do think that we should be comrades with other leftists until the right is much less of a threat than it is now. We can fight amongst ourselves when we fix things more than they are fixed. This may also mean supporting liberals or centrists if they help us gain progress against the right. But that is a rant for a whole nother day, actually. And I'm just going to go into the outro. For everything else, you can check out the show notes at thebrainstormpodcast.com or our website, brainstormblog.net. Thanks to our financial supporters, Kayla, Kim, Stephanie, Zach, the Utah Outcasts, Will, Aaron, Daryl, Bob Glenn, Dustin Doesn't Suck That Much, Magnus, several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave, Positively Skeptical, Rob, the Podonk Polymath, the Flying Spaghetti Monster, Sauce Be Upon Him, Freethinker215, and Larry. If you want to join them and help the show grow, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast, or you can do a one-time donation at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. Or go buy some stuff at tpublic.com/stores/brainstorm-podcast-gear. Thanks to Dave for our intro music. Thanks to Aaron Rabbi for doing the voiceover for that intro. You can find his podcast at voidpod.com. Thanks to Alex Capper-Murdoch for doing the voiceover for our ad, and thanks to Jason Camo for our outro music. You can find his stuff at aloststateofmind.com. All music played is either with permission or under the SOCAN license to play. For more information on SOCAN, you can check out the music license info page on our website, brainstormblog.net. Remember to give us a rating, a thumbs up, or a fave on your podcatcher of choice. Join our Facebook group, like our page, follow us on Twitter, share the show, and spread the word. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.
Holy crap, did I just forget the name? Okay. I hope you can edit this out, because now I gotta go look it up. Oh, this is gonna bug me when I finally find it.
I got a couple thoughts, but I want to wait until you get the books.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just keep it there for a moment. I'm almost got it. The Dispossessed, son of a bitch. So the book is